My name is Seth Feeman. I serve as Executive Director and CEO here at the Frist Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. As is our custom at the Frist, I'd like to first offer a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum sits on land the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples, elders, and their ancestors call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them and offer deep gratitude and respect to the land and water that support us. Every time I make this land acknowledgement, I think about its relationship to our current exhibitions and projects, and today it seems like it has particular significance, because tonight we're celebrating the opening of Farm to Table, Art, Food, and Identity in the Age of Impressionism. And as you'll hear in the conversation in just a moment, the exhibition in many ways turns on the concept of terroir, a French word that simply means soil or land, or territory, but signifies both the environmental features of a place that give agriculture certain characteristics or flavors, as well as nationalistic concepts of identity and belonging to a specific place. It's sort of something like as American as apple pie, to say that an apple is American, which is also not true, and to say that it is something about your identity to have a red apple as if it's something uniquely American. So you're going to hear a lot about that in the talk tonight. Associations of place are exactly what ties together the three exhibitions that we have opened today. In addition to Farm to Table, which focuses on artists making work in France, we have opened a companion project in partnership with the Tennessee State Museum called Tennessee Harvest, 1870s to 1920s, which brings these questions about French national identity back here to Tennessee by focusing on Tennessee artists who absorbed and adapted European approaches to agrarian subjects and painting techniques. I want to thank Candice Candito, Senior Curator of Fine Art and Decorative Art at the Tennessee State Museum, and the museum's director, Ashley Howell, alumni of this institution, for joining us in this project and for being here with us tonight. The questions of nation and national identity go even further if you look at the third exhibition that we have on view today in the Gordon Kapp Gallery. It's titled M. Florine Demosthene and Didier William, What the Body Carries. This show features work by two contemporary artists with connections to Haiti, whose people liberated themselves from French colonization at the dawn of the 19th century, some decades prior to the Age of Impressionism that you'll see in Farm to Table. You'll hear much more about nationality and identity in a dialogue tomorrow when the two artists appear here at 2 p.m., and so I'll invite you all to come back and hear them in dialogue, and I want to thank them for sharing their work with us and for being here tonight as well. The Frist Art Museum functions itself as a placemaker, creating a sense of belonging and community by bringing different people together along with art to share their perspectives and sometimes debate different perspectives. And so I want to take just a moment to acknowledge and thank our Farm to Table partners, many of whom are here tonight with us for making community with us. Farm to Table is organized by the American Federation of Arts and the Chrysler Museum of Art, where I am an alumni from. From the American Federation of Arts, we are delighted to welcome Director and CEO Pauline Ferlenza, Curator Anke van Wagenberg, and trustees Claire McKeon, Stephen Riley, and Kapara Ryan, who are here with us. Thank you for coming a long way for many of you to be here tonight. Several lenders from near and far also join us tonight, and I want to acknowledge and thank them. We have friends with us from Cheekwood Estate and Gardens, Vanderbilt University Museum of Art, collectors connected to Stanford Fine Arts, the Dixon Gallery and Gardens in Memphis, and the Hunter Museum of American Art in Chattanooga. Thank you all for coming here tonight. Farm to Table is generously supported by Martha McMillan and Monique Schoen-Warshaw. Additional support has been provided by Betsy S. Barbanel, Lee White Galvis, Alan Green, Claire McKeon, Betsy Piniver Schiff, the Gladys Kriebel Delmas Foundation, the Dr. Lee McCormick Edwards Charitable Foundation, and the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts. Yeah. This project is supported in part also by the National Endowment for the Arts. For their support of Farm to Table and Tennessee Harvest here at the Frist, we also thank our platinum sponsor, HCA Healthcare TriStar Health, and our education and community engagement supporter, the Wingate Foundation. We're also grateful for continuing operating support from the Frist Foundation, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. So tonight, we are very fortunate to have exhibition curator Andrew Eschelbacher here to join our chief curator, Mark Scala, for a conversation about the exhibition Farm to Table. Andrew serves as Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. He previously held positions as Director of Curatorial Affairs at the American Federation of Arts, as well as positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. In addition to curating Farm to Table, he has previously curated exhibitions and edited catalogs, including Monuments and Myths, The America of Sculptors Augustus St. Gaudens and Daniel Chester French, which I expect everyone here to know very well since it was on view here last year. And he's curated several other projects, including A New American Sculpture, Lachaise, Laurent, Nadelman, and Zorak. As you'll hear from Andrew in a few moments, he has a unique way that we got to hear this morning at the media preview of drawing your eye to expressive details in a work of art that highlight the way that looking closely will reveal larger stories about history, culture, and in this case, gastronomy. We're in for a treat, and so I'm very grateful that he came to join us. With that, I will do my duty to ask you to silence your cell phones and note the emergency exits. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark and Andrew.
Now? Yes. Okay, excellent. It's so great to see you all here tonight. The Frist Art Museum receives a lot of exhibition proposals. People know about us around the world, and they all have great ideas for us. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But in this case, when we saw the proposal for Farm to Table, Art, Food, and Identity in the Age of Impressionism, it like hit every single thing. It hit food. And of course, some of you may know Nashville is a food town. You know, it's sort of exploding, the restaurant scene. Even the farmers markets, just the local growers. There's something really special about being in this community. My wife and I belong to a CSA that also brings fresh food to one of the great French restaurants in town. And so that idea of, you know, the freshness and proximity to food and kind of circumventing the global food chain in a way. I mean, you can't really get around it. But that idea of supporting your local makers, your local producers, the communion you have when you go to the farmer's market, you know, all of those things, I think, really rung true for us. One of the things that sort of surprised me was that this show hadn't been done before. You know, if you take two of the great things about French culture, and truly about world culture, it's cuisine and it's art, especially in the late 19th century. And, you know, I'd like to start by just kind of asking Andrew how this came about. I mean, what was your thinking? It seems like it's a stroke of brilliance, but it may have been long in the cooking, so to speak.
Brilliance, I'm not sure. Hunger, yes. The show really came about 11 years ago. I was a professor at the time and had a group of students in France, and I was applying for another job and asked to give a job talk, present an exhibition. My research wasn't going to be really appropriate for that type of job talk, so I had to come up with something new and on the fly. And I was, you know, I couldn't get there, and I was in Paris with my wife, probably drinking too much wine, definitely eating too many French fries and steak frites. And I was like, well, I want to do a show about this. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the concept is, but France and food and art are just so central to it. Started to dig a little bit deeper, and we'll get into some of the works that got there. But absolutely, that there was something about this, and my wife actually had the exact same reaction as you when I told her, I think this is what I'm going to do. And she said, well, that's already been done. I said, you would think, but it hasn't. You know, for some reason, it hasn't been done. And so I started working on this, and that was 11 years ago. So now we're here.
You may know we just opened the Café Cheeserie, which is very fromage forward. If you haven't been to it, you need to definitely go. It's absolutely great. But I expected when we saw this show, when we saw the paintings come out of the crates, and I'd seen, of course, photographs of them. I expected to be hungrier than I really am. I go through the show, and it doesn't make me hungry. And I'm trying to figure out why it doesn't make me hungry. And I think it's because it's not totally a show about food or even about cuisine. It's about the people behind the food. It's about the people who grow the food, who bring it to market, who butcher it. And I'll tell you, we're going to see some serious butchery in a minute. So that idea that it's really about so many other things. As we go through the gallery, I tried to set it up so there's always a conversation about class, about economics, about the haves and the have-nots, about rural and urban, this kind of bicameral approach, because I think that's the way you have interesting conversations. I don't know if that's really what you were thinking as you set this up.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea, we all use the expression, here you are what you eat, right? That's the American expression. Comes from a 19th century French book that says, tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are. What you eat is about who you are in so many ways, in every way. And the reason that French food has the reputation that it does in many ways, the reputation it does, I mean, you all must have heard, oh, there's a show about French food, and that had certain connotations for you, right? Well, so many of those emerge actually from the 18th and the 19th century of French writers telling us that French food was central to French culture. That Antoine Carême, one of the first important sort of celebrity chefs, said France was the only place you could get a good meal. Of all the glorious things in France, Eugène Briffaut said that the glories of France, the pinnacle of France, was what was seen on Paris's tables. He wrote that in 1843. So this isn't a 21st century concept. And really, to your point, it's about the people. But we get to a moment in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s where that idea of what it means to be French is very much in question. Things that had been taken for granted were no longer, you weren't able to take them for granted in the same way. The world was changing in so many ways. And all of that comes across through what was on the table, what was on the farms, who was farming, who was cooking, who was eating, what were their relationships together. And so, yeah, it really becomes about food, but sometimes a banana isn't just a banana.
As Freud said. Well, let's, some of you may have seen the show already, but let's dive in and take a look at what you have described as kind of the starting point. When you say the age of Impressionism, part of that seemed like a marketing device. Okay, put the word Impressionism in there, and they will come. And there is a fair amount of Impressionism, but it's also true that there are realist artists, Barbizon school artists, academic painters. They're all put together, and they're all working at the same time. So this idea that we have of there being a superseding, one style leads to another style, killing the previous style, and blah, blah, blah. That is put to the test, I think, in this show. These artists knew each other, they talked to each other, they're familiar with each other's work, even if they're not sharing the same style. But I think that the age of Impressionism is sort of understood to have begun around 1870, with the first Impressionist exhibition, 1874. Leading up to that, artists were experimenting with the ideas of Impressionism. But you really start with this painting, 1871.
1871, and this comes, it is the starting point for the show. It's the rat cellar during the siege of Paris. I feel a little bit like the Golden Girls, but picture this. In Paris in 1870, there was the Franco-Prussian War. And the French thought that this would be a quick, easy victory for the French, and oh boy, were they wrong. The Franco-Prussian War was this devastating event for France. The Second Empire falls. It's a military catastrophe. It's an industrial catastrophe. France loses 2 of its eastern provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. It's a total and complete embarrassment for France and a shock to the system. But central to that was the Prussian siege of Paris. The Prussians cut off Paris from the rest of the nation. To get communication out, they had to send balloons up, right? Hot air balloons to get communication out. So Paris is cut off from the nation. And people ate cats and rats and dogs. That was what people had to eat. Wealthy people ate the zoo. Literally, they shot the zoo elephants Castor and Pollux so that they would have dinner on Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve. And so that you get this real sense of food being important, but also food being crucial in this moment and unstable in this moment. Food had always been universal, and now maybe it's not in that way. Food was universal, and everything in France, even though it's just a very Parisian-focused crisis, this food crisis, people weren't starving everywhere else. So much of what French systems had been about provisioning Paris, getting food to Paris for the Ancien Regime kings and on and on. So Paris has no food. That's not a Paris crisis. That's a national crisis. So that ends 1871. After the Franco-Prussian War, the Commune comes up, which is a civil war in France, Paris against the Versailles government from March to May 1871. And the Salon of the next year, Narcisse Chailloux, who quite honestly is a fairly minor painter, but creates this work that is so representative of what we have. Because this could be a moment of intense privation, something incredibly sad. It's a kid butchering rats because there's nothing else to eat. That's not a happy scene. But look at the painting closely. You see the way that the rat is displayed on the back of his chair? It may not be appetizing for us.
There's a detail.
Oh, perfect. So it may not be appetizing, well, depending on when you're eating dinner, perfect. Not appetizing for us, but it's displayed in the same way as a fine side of beef would have been in a shop. And then there are rats set on the ground, but what really gets it is sort of the relish and the smirk and the pride that he takes in this artisanal craft. And he's wearing the bleu, blanc, and rouge of the tricolor flag, that he is so much French. And so instead of this being about privation, this is about the way that food and butchering rats and having the pride in the butchering rats becomes about fortitude. So instead of privation, it's pride. Instead of this being a moment of the collapse of France, it's the moment where food and France's food traditions and France's food culture can be part of the virile rebirth of the nation. And so this is at the Salon the year after. Everyone who was at the Salon would have known exactly what this was referring to. And instead of talking about the depths of despair, it's talking about the possibilities and the way that food is central to this notion of Frenchness that can continue even beyond the moment of crisis.
Have you all seen that painting? I mean, it is an extraordinary painting. It's only 20 inches tall.
Yeah, it's not very big.
No, and some of the paintings are gigantic and very powerful, but this has a magnetic draw, and it's amazing how the artist can just pack so much information into it. The broadsides on the wall, talking about hygiene, the tricolor flag flying in front of the young man who's also wearing blue, red, and white. Information, and I think one of the things that strikes me about a lot of the works in this show is there's a political dimension, whether it's obvious, whether it's veiled, whether it's intended. There's a way of looking at these as being reflective of political realities, or at least social realities. Lucy Lepard, many other people have said, Lin-Manuel Miranda have said, all art is political. And I think that all art at least has a political dimension, and that certainly comes through with this particular work. Let's talk about this one while we're on the subject of...
Just getting all the raw meat out in front.
Yeah.
Just going with it. But this, as far away as this is from the rat cellar, there is also that connection to it. What we see here is Victor Gilbert painting the meat haulers underneath Les Halles, which is the central market of Paris. And Les Halles was built in part to create order and hygiene and safety in a neighborhood that had traditionally been associated with vice and working class rebellion. So that was the connotation of this space in the 1870s and 80s. And what Gilbert does is he creates these three men hoisting a side of beef up in the air. And this looks sort of like hard work, it's hard labor. But think about it for the time. A lot of French writers in the 1870s, 1880s, Zola in particular, created a slippage between people carrying animal carcasses and people carrying revolutionary corpses. That was one of those metaphors that happened frequently. So what you see here is workers in an area traditionally known for vice and working class rebellion hoisting an animal side on their shoulders, though animal side sometimes meant dead revolutionaries. And so this painting is about meat, and it's about the labor of the markets, but it's also flirting, at least, with those connotations. But one thing that Gilbert does is he flirts with it. He makes it very clear that that's what he's doing, but he also gives us a little degree of safety. We know it's okay. They're not looking over their shoulder to see if there's anything, anyone coming to see them. And most importantly, he shows the architecture of Les Halles. You see those arches in the background? That was meant to be the organizing rational principle of the area. So they're doing this under the cover of an organized rational France. So yes, it may flirt with that idea of danger, but don't worry, we're still within that network of safety. And so it's playing with the political dimensions, but also saying we're not in that moment of crisis right now.
Did that have to do with the suppression of the commune, with being careful not to overstep?
Absolutely. The Communard, and just very briefly, the Commune was a civil war, leftist Parisian uprising that came just after the Franco-Prussian War and was very violently suppressed by the Versailles government. And Communards were executed en masse and exiled. And they just came back to Paris. They were allowed to come back to France. 1879 was the first amnesty. 1880 was the second amnesty. And the events of the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune were the defining events for a generation. And it's the generation that were the Impressionists. And so they're very much thinking about this is just the period when communards are coming back to France. And there's real nervousness around whether or not there will be more revolution, how this will happen, how they fit within society, whether that was a good idea to bring the communard back. Or it raises more debates about whether they ever should have been exiled in the first place. So that notion of the commune, very much there. I mean, the closest, I'm 44, I was 21 years old on September 11th. Like, that's been one of the defining events of my young adulthood, right? Same thing for people here, is everything relates back to that, even when it's not directly related to that.
The scale of the painting is sort of extraordinary, and you think about artists who painted for the salon. Mm-hmm. We're trying to make dramatic, powerful statements, oftentimes through scale, but also there's the quality of it being a history painting, a history of an everyday scene, which signals a kind of shift. It's not the classic, military scene or something like that, but it does seem to be connected to that idea.
There's this idea, and my friend James Hargrove introduced me to this term, the academic avant-garde, right? You think about the history painting in that way, but many of the artists in the Age of Impressionism, as you said, naturalists, realists, impressionists, are very concerned with the everyday. trying to capture the quotidian realities of the time. We know how the Impressionists did that, thinking about the ephemerality of light or the transience of shadow, all of that. But there are other painters who don't work in that style who are also thinking about the everyday, but they don't do it in a way that's about the transience. They're still trying to elevate the everyday to the level of salon painting in that sense.
Yeah, that's a great way to segue into the next painting that we're going to talk about. We've talked about Impressionism, and this is probably the classic Impressionist painting in the entire exhibition, one of Monet's haystacks or grain stacks. We've talked about this, I think everybody has the understanding of Impressionism that you just described. Sort of, it's about capturing ephemeral qualities of light as they play across the surface. Monet was very famous for repeating a motif again and again under different conditions. And so we understand this to be sort of an immediate artistic response to these conditions, which sounds a little, very much aligned with the notion of sensitivity to nature, but a little clinical in a way too, which is sort of interesting. So when you look at this, it seems to be about something different than that. Talk about that. Talk about his series and what they signify.
Yeah, I would say yes and. In terms of, there's absolutely that quality where it's light, it's shadow, it's different times of day, it's different conditions of weather, whatever it may be. But Monet painted 3 series paintings. The first were these grain stacks. He painted poplar trees, and he painted Rouen Cathedral. And these are 3 subjects that are central to the notion of Frenchness. And so this is the first, but in the 19th century, people believed that the cathedrals were France's greatest monuments. The greatest monuments they ever built were the cathedrals. And so that is embedded in him painting cathedrals, is painting something that's inherently a French glory. The poplars in the landscape is part of the countryside that's revered. But where he starts is the grain stack, because it goes back to that notion that the food and the grain becomes fundamental and is French. That notion of terroir that Seth was talking about earlier is so deeply embedded in the consciousness and in the psyche that it's French. And while he captures, and this is where the yes and comes in with the light and the shadow, because he's capturing the effect of light, the different time of day, the different weather in the 20-odd paintings that he does. But the grain stack itself is timeless. And so he's contrasting the modernity, everything connected with the ephemeral and the transient, with the constant. The grain stack, because this grain stack that we're looking at in 1891, there was something really similar in 1791, 1691, 1591. You can go back in that way. The way that it was produced may be differently. The people producing it may have been different, but that idea of the French soil giving you the grain that became fundamental to bread, to pastry, to all of that is a constant thing. And so he's playing with that timelessness against the modernity. And for me, there's something, and maybe this is just me, and you all may feel differently, but there's something a little melancholy here, because you have that tension between the timeless and the modern, and we all may feel it in our daily lives with the way that our current world moves so fast that tomorrow, we don't know what tomorrow brings in many ways. What's the new invention? What's the technology? What's the this? What's the that? And it disconnects us from so much that we do know, right? And so many people want that. What do you know? There's that dream of the country house, or maybe it was making sourdough bread during the pandemic, right? Like something that grounds you in tradition. Even while the world seems to be spinning out of control, that's very much part of something I feel in this. Did you make sourdough?
No, I didn't make sourdough.
Crochet?
I didn't crochet. Nope.
I was
in Zoom meetings all the time. That was my hobby, to be in Zoom meetings. One of the things, I think that melancholy quality, I get that. I mean, I really, there's something almost, and this is not a great photograph. You've seen the painting, right? Some of you. It's really, it's a brilliant painting, but that there's a density kind of part of it, I think, is the lack of humanity.
Absolutely.
You know, and so in the gallery, we placed it next to this painting. You know, how did that haystack get there? What's it even for? You know, what are these haystacks doing in the field? Does anybody know what haystacks are for? What? Yeah, food for the livestock, bedding for the livestock. So there's a real reason for it, but for Monet, it becomes something else. It becomes like a building.
Right. It becomes architectonic.
Yeah, absolutely. So we thought it'd be interesting to put this image next to it. These are people making haystacks. And why are they making haystacks? Who are these people? Why does she look so happy? You know, that's kind of that's a killer for me. You know, she's doing backbreaking work. There is in European art since Bruegel, there's been a fascination with peasant life. You know, oftentimes peasant life was represented as either sort of charming and folksy or grungy, and peasants are thought of as being little more than animals, kind of brutes. And that goes back, you know, hundreds of years. But by the 19th century, a change has taken place, and the peasant is represented differently. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and really especially in France, it's from the 1870s, second half of the 1870s onwards. If you look at Millet paintings of rural laborers, that animalistic quality, that's often there. In the literature, people in the provinces were described as savage. Well, in the 1870s and the 1880s, when France was trying to rebound from this moment of absolute calamity, there's a huge effort to centralize the nation. So that there's a great expression about Italy, of after Italy was made, they said, now we've made Italy, now we must make Italians. It's not exactly the same in France, but similar, because people in Brittany, and maybe still, identified as Breton before they identify as French. People in Normandy identified as being Norman before they identified as French. And there's this real effort in the 1870s and 80s to bring those provinces into the nation, to the point that there are laws made that you're no longer allowed to teach in the Breton language in Brittany, that all instruction must be in French, and that they're trying to codify a certain national set of values. And there are great stories about the Tour de France by two children that were children's books that happened. But if you're going to do that for a Parisian audience, and this is for a Parisian audience, you can't be saying we're incorporating the savage, the animalistic to be part of it. What you have to be saying is we're incorporating these people who may not be exactly like us and who may be behind the times, they said that, but who are useful for the nation and who are beneficial for the nation. So she's happy because she is serving the nation. She is farming in a way that is putting together the grain to feed the animals that will therefore do the work necessary to till the fields, and on and on and on. So her role is part of this health of the nation, and she has to be presented in that way, of someone who can help, who can support the nation as a strong Republican woman.
Yeah, I think it is just fascinating, and when we get to the section, we'll talk briefly later on about in the Tennessee Harvest Show, how American artists would go to Europe and be inspired by these images of peasants, and then come back to this country, and then realize, well, we don't have peasants. What do we have? You know, and so we'll talk a little bit about that too. But let's look at another similar picture.
And this is one of your favorites.
You know, it's one of my favorites to talk about. It's not one of my favorites to look at, necessarily. I mean, I like it, you know, and I like it because of its scale. It's huge, it's monumental. And again, that idea of importance tied to scale. So this is about something more than a shepherd, I think. You know, and it seems, you know, if you're painting for the salon, there is a large emphasis placed on allegory. And for me, this probably is an allegory of the Good Shepherd, shepherding his flock through a stormy environment. You can see the light coming from the background and heading into the darkness, but you also see light coming from the front, but you only see it reflected on the sheep's faces. So it's a turbulent scene that he's guiding them through. You know, I'm almost tempted to say that prod, that stick he's wearing, kind of reminds me of a crucifix. So I don't know, maybe that's just projection on my part. What do you think?
I like the farmland.
Sorry?
I like the farmland. There's something about that, you know, yes, it's a pastoral landscape in that way, but look at that, just the extent of the farmland behind and the lushness of it, the greens in it, and it's greens that speak, those dark greens that speak to richness, right? The richness of the soil, the richness of everything in there. I find it just, you know, yes, there is certainly allegorical meaning to it, but it's embedded within this landscape of lushness.
Yeah, I think there are so many different ways to look at a work of art, and we all have, you know, fall into the trap, I think, of looking at it from the lens of the 21st century, and sometimes sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, oftentimes you can't even prove it.
And sometimes you say landscape of lushness and you hate yourself.
You know, that's going to be the headline in tomorrow's newspaper. So let's
My
change
apologies.
gears. Let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk about this painting. This is a small painting, and it seems oddly out of place in relation to some of the other ones we've talked about.
Absolutely. It's, you know, this is small, but it's, for me, one of the most important paintings in the show, and we've talked about this a little bit. But when you get to the notion, when we talk about terroir, the soil, all of that, embedded in that is also the people who are working there, and that notion, and a lot of it becomes part of a proto-fascist language about the soil and the blood in the soil that you hear as part of, and this was happening in the late 19th century, it's part of Nazi rhetoric. Because it's about the people's connection with the soil and what it means to be French. But what happens in the age of colonialism, where what we're looking at is France, if we go through the 19th century conception, we're looking at France, but this is northern Algeria. And so we're looking at banana fields in a test garden in northern Algeria on the coast. And bananas don't grow well in metropolitan France. They don't have the climate for it. So if the French wanted to grow bananas, they had to do it in the provinces, or in the colonies, excuse me. They had to go to the colonies to grow it. Same for mangoes or anything else. But it asks really interesting questions, because are the colonies French terroir? This doesn't go back the centuries that the Norman soils go back with this idea of Frenchness. What do we get there? And then this is about, in many ways, the resource drive that was part of colonialism, of going to the colonies because they could provide resources that weren't available in the mainland. Well, showing it in that way puts it at odds with the other part of the colonial discussion at the time, which was that you needed colonialism because it was a, quote, civilizing mission. But how do you reconcile the civilizing mission with using this land explicitly for its resources? And these are tensions that we see now and conflicts that we see now, but they're also conflicts that were very much part of the debates of the 1880s. There were huge splits in the Republican Party about whether or not France could actually have a civilizing mission, because it was the nation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which talked about the equality of people. Well, you can't civilize someone else if everyone's equal. So these are all the debates of the time, but really it just comes down, and they're all seen in a simple banana. Like, that's something that just becomes a springboard for so much more, the way that in certain other paintings, a sugar cube that you might see next to your coffee can be a springboard into thinking about the networks of sugar production and consumption, which take you through the colonies and also take you into the Napoleonic era when the French had to start making beet sugar because of blockades. So I love these works like this because it's so simple, it's so straightforward, it's so much part of our everyday, but it adds so much more dimension to it.
Just a little note, when Andrew says Republican, He's talking about French Republicans.
Of the 19th century. Those who believed that a republic was the right form of government, as opposed to a monarchy or an empire, in terms of that.
So then let's take that idea a little bit further, and looking at this painting, which was, they know exactly where it was made, in the, is it Biskra district of Algeria, right on the edge of the Sahara Desert. And it's really a wonderful painting. If you haven't had a chance to see it, you're going to be blown away by this painting. But it shows essentially an Algerian kitchen, I guess, a food preparation area. And that idea of France justifying its colonization because it's a civilizing influence is sort of kind of evident throughout this painting. You see completely unhygienic conditions. You see a kid milking a sheep, chickens are running around, somebody grinding a grain. So it just looks as if they're really in need of a good French kitchen, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's drawing that parallel, and it's showing the differences that you'd see. There are images of French kitchens, there are images of French workers milking cows, whatever it may be. The fact that it's in the interior, now this might be quite normal and quite fine, but to the French eye in 1882, this says that's not the way we do it. We need to teach them, whether right or wrong. And so that adds to it. And so this is a big part of that. So when we're thinking about food, it really does transcend all of those. You were talking about the dichotomies of class or whatever it may be, that it's rich and poor, but it also gets to rich and poor. It gets to issues of colonialism, the center and the margins. It gets to issues of gender, male and female, on and on and on. So these paintings, as much as they're just telling us one story, they're asking really big questions about the central debates that destabilized France throughout these years.
Another Gilbert painting, very different from the meat haulers.
Very different. I'm not sure who said I love that painting, but I agree with you 100%. I heard it in the audience, and I agree with you 100%. I love this painting. So Gilbert was the painter of Les Halles, far and away. And what he's showing us is the carreau of the Les Halles. It's the area just outside the pavilions. And that's where the market gardeners who live just outside Paris would come in and sow their produce in these makeshift stands. And whereas in the pavilion, everything is ordered straight rows here it's a little bit more chaotic. But what he's showing us is all of these different vignettes that you see on the carreau. The girl selling lemons, the young chef who clearly just got sent out of the kitchen to go buy something that they were missing in the kitchen. The woman in the apron who is probably picking up food to cook for her employer or her employer's family. The woman sitting pretty stoically in that patched dress is a gardener who's probably gotten up at 3 a.m. to drive the horse-drawn carriage into Paris from Nanterre or wherever she was coming from. And so we have all of these vignettes of a very local market scene, and then around it, you have modern Paris. You have the omnibuses. Look at the men in their top hats and their very cosmopolitan dress. And it shows the way that they coexist, right? Like it's not one or the other. It's that these things can coexist at totally sympathetically. That you can have the rural together with the cosmopolitan because that's both part of the culture. Again, it's that yes and, which helps to counteract when you asked about the influence of the commune. A civil war is an us-them. This is a yes and that adds to it.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, and to think about this in the context of our own farmers markets. The idea that people of all walks of life, of all income levels, are coming together. Maybe not all income levels. You're not going to pay $2 for a tomato grown in Rutherford County if you are a single parent with 4 children and making $20,000 a year. You're going to get the Mexican tomatoes. I think there is, even here, there is that kind of class issue or income level
yes
issue?
and no, because it's one of the aspects about French markets that's a little bit different than the way that we experience it in the United States, is that they're intended for all. When I was a graduate and student in France and making $15,000 a year, I did all my shopping at the market, because you could, what was fresh, because what was fresh was going to be what was cheap, and it was going to be plentiful, and you got to know the people there. So instead of doing it at the Monoprix or wherever, I would go and I would see the guy and I'd buy 3 clementines, and then the next week I'd buy 3 clementines, and he'd remember me from the last time, and he'd charge me for 3 and toss 2 more in, that type of thing. And they get, because you have that personal relationship, because you're dealing with people, and because you're buying what's fresh, you're buying what's now, and it's part of the culture that's supposed to be accessible. Because food, whether you're talking about something like elaborate dinner at the Tour d'Argent in Paris, or you're talking about the open-air market, that notion of tell me what you eat and I'll tell you what you are runs through all of it. And that's why that crisis in 1870 is so important, because it takes this moment where food was universal and says, maybe it's not so universal. Maybe it's not this thing that binds us together. Maybe it really is this thing that's an us and them.
We've already, I think Megan, how are we doing on time?
Is that a high five?
Okay, so let's walk past it, because you've already talked about the sort of effort to kind of force the Bretons and the Normans to speak in French, and that goes along with this painting, which is sort of a resistance to that. But I think that we've covered that. We could talk about Pissarro a little bit. Pissarro's, again, that idea of art being political. Pissarro was a self-proclaimed anarchist. He hung out with anarchists. And when we think of anarchists today, we think of bomb throwers. He wasn't a bomb thrower, but he was pretty radical. And you look at these paintings, you think, where's the radicality? Mm-hmm. Is it there?
Well, critics at the time thought it was. Yeah, Pissarro was referred to as the cabbage painter. He didn't actually paint that many paintings of cabbage, but he was known as the cabbage painter. And it was a terrible insult, because what it meant was that he concerned himself with things that were very low class, that was his subject, and that his painting style was layer on layer on layer, not the way that you see at a salon painting where there's that high finish. So Pissarro paints this gardener, the old peasant with cabbage. And he does this in multiple moments of his career over the course of 12 years. And it becomes very much a self-portrait in that way, but it's radical in the way that we're thinking about painting. Because if you just sort of, if you can, don't look at the figure and just look at that wall of cabbage, you're essentially seeing abstraction. Think about what abstraction would have looked like to an audience that was so used to figuration, and everything needed to be representational. Pissarro is bringing all of that in, and that there's this, especially in this foreground here, you don't see any real definition, but you start to know what it is. And he's doing this painting style in such a modern way, but again, same as Monet, we get to that question of timelessness, because people were pruning their cabbages. People of working class stock are pruning their cabbages in 1895 and 1795 and all the way back. And so there's something that is very radical about this. This was his type of bomb, and this was incendiary at the time. It wasn't particularly well liked. We liked it enough to put it on the cover of the catalog, which is for sale in the bookshop.
Yeah, I'm particularly drawn. Pissarro, it doesn't seem revolutionary. If we look at, say, that, which is also Pissarro, talking about social turpitude. This is really a critique of capitalism. And so very, very strong, powerful. These are something different. Pissarro came from a wealthy Sephardic Jewish family, from the Danish West Indies. He ended up marrying his mother's maidservant, and I don't think that the figure on the left is her, but he's very sympathetic with people who are working hard to make a living. So I think that in that sense, we can see his humanism, if not his politics. I'm going to move very quickly through and kind of skip over a lot because you can see it in the galleries. Let's talk a little bit about Courbet and then move to the Tennessee Harvest Show. I'd like to kind of at least introduce some of those ideas.
Absolutely. So just very briefly, Courbet was a communard and was imprisoned for his role in the Commune. There you see him in prison. He was largely responsible for knocking over the Vendôme column, that Napoleonic column. He pulled it down with others. But when he was in prison, he was able to paint still lifes, and he painted still lifes of fruit. And these aren't the most beautiful, the most perfect, these are the everyday fruit, right? These are the fruit with bruises on them. These are the fruits that you see at the sort of the misfits market, right? That type of thing. But that's part of what he's doing. He's painting what he would have called the sort of authentic fruit, not the pristine, which very much fits within his own idea of what he valued in people. He valued the real, not the ideal, in terms of his painting, but also in terms of his politics. And doing this from prison in a moment of resistance, he's painting the real. And so it's very political in that way, even though it's just a bucket of fruit.
Well, we have to talk about Bouguereau. We've seen peasant imagery out in the fields, out in the countryside. We've seen poor workers hauling meat. And then this young girl probably is working in a scullery, eating from a bowl. She seems relatively healthy and well coiffed. But she's also, I think, representative of the artist's ideal of empathizing with the less fortunate.
But without really an idea of what the less fortunate actually look like and how they behave.
I think so, yeah.
Right? Like she doesn't look, there is that allusion to it, right? But this, whereas if Courbet, and this is a great comparison, because if Courbet is about the real, this is very much is about the ideal. This is an idealization of the youthfulness of a working or poor class that we have there. But look at the rosiness in their cheeks, the smile, and there's something, the dress, absolutely. That's a nice dress for someone who doesn't have a lot of money, right? There's something about that, but there's also something amazingly endearing that you see with children of, she's enjoying using the ladle. This isn't because, right? This isn't because, oh, this is a hardship to use the ladle. My 3-year-old son likes nothing more than eating with a giant wooden spoon and spilling all over the floor. But there's something about childhood in doing that, in eating out of the bowl. Yes, it says that she doesn't have the dish. She is not served at the table. There's all of that. But there's also this very sweet, cute, human quality to it. So that has the ideal, but that's some of what's brilliant about the Bouguereau, is that he can take us to the ideal, but also ground it in the instances of the everyday.
Yeah, and he makes me feel a little less bad about the feeling I have for the girls. So I will definitely buy this painting and hang it in my mansion and feel good about things.
That would be a very American thing to do, because some of Bouguereau's biggest audience was in the United States, and he was a really, really influential teacher for American painters, and important for American collectors. And I think that in the Tennessee Harvest Show, I think that there's some real connections between Bouguereau and the artists in Tennessee.
Yeah, let's flip to that show. So this is the Tennessee Harvest Show. We had some space in the gallery, and we thought, well, what can we do to sort of have a conversation that actually relates to our own history, our own region? And I remembered this painting from the Tennessee State Museum, and I thought, well, this is a really interesting starting point. And then when I began to research the artist, George Chambers, and learned that he had actually studied, this is his little quote about peasants and how wonderful images of peasant women are. He had actually studied with Julien Dupré. I thought, bingo, this is a really interesting story. A lot of American artists went to Paris, Munich, New York, London, Rome to learn what they could, and oftentimes they came back to share their newfound skills with their communities, and George Chambers did that and was very impressed with Julien Dupré, but that connection that we made, and thanks very much again to Candice Candito for helping me sort of understand and see these, all the Tennessee artists in this exhibition in the context, not just of European art, but in the context of this region, this state, especially after the Civil War between 1870 and 1870s and 1920s. So it's really just been a wonderful kind of follow-up, I think, to the Farm to Table show. You mentioned the artist who's Willie Betty Newman, and she studied with Bouguereau. And so you can see a definite connection between the two. So, and this would be true in most American states. You would be able to do the same kind of comparison. And so this idea of there being, a distinctly American painting, with distinctly American subject matter, distinctly American styles, I think is put into question by this. There's definitely that kind of Euro-American discourse that's happening in this. We see it in the wonderful Chicken by Cornelius Hankins, putting that next to the Courbet. They both have kind of a democratic sort of appeal, a democratic sort of reference to poverty, to people living in want or that don't have an extravagant diet. So, so I hope you enjoy that show. I hope you enjoy all the shows. Come back tomorrow for the great talk with Didier and Florine. Interesting that we were able to put an Algerian scene next to this gallery with Haitian artists in it, and it helps sort of reinforce that the history of French colonialism in really interesting ways. So anytime we can make those connections for people, we will definitely try to do it. So thanks for being here. If there are any questions, we'll be happy to entertain them.
Hi. In the painting of the shepherd, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I looked at all the different sheep, and they seemed to have different expressions. They didn't all look the same. And I noticed that in the foreground there were the black sheep, and then it looked as though all of the rest of the sheep were white. And am I imagining things, or do they have different expressions?
I think that's a great question. I think we sometimes look at paintings of animals and say, oh, it's an animal, or whatever it is, without actually looking at the expressions. And I think some of the things that you see in the show, I think some of what you're seeing here in terms of the different colors is due to the light and the shadow. But the different expressions, absolutely, because the artists are really paying attention to this. Go look at the Rosa Bonheur painting in the first gallery. My colleague Mark Castro at the Chrysler described those cows as the gossipiest cows you can ever imagine. You can tell there are two cows in the foreground that are definitely talking about the third cow. So your idea that no, go look at it. I promise you, that is what's happening in that painting. But yes, your idea that the sheep have different expression, that they're thinking about this in real ways, absolutely. I think that's great.
My question has to do with the political intentionality, as you describe this, of the artist that you showed us today. Was it really an overriding concern, or was it simply visual and what it was they wanted to express visually?
I think that these artists are living in a time where the central question of the everyday is, what does it mean to be French? And that's what's at stake. This is an age where the government turns over turned over in 1872, 1875, 1879. It kept turning over in the 1880s. There's almost another civil war in 1889. So it is so much of the time that you can't avoid it. And while this show is very much about painting and the visual, there's certainly a political or a socially engaged aspect, whether it's definitely political or whether it's socially engaged. So all of these artists are socially engaged in their own ways. Some, like Pissarro, who is an anarchist and supporting anarchist causes, or others like there's a beautiful Millet painting from 1872, which is about retreat from the political. He leaves Paris, or he leaves Barbizon for the Franco-Prussian War, and he goes back to his home area in Normandy, and he's painting a countryside that you wouldn't know that the country had just been devastated by war. So it's about a retreat from that at the same time.
One more question?
Go see the gossipy cows.